You ready?
I'm ready.
Hello everyone, I'm Cameron Holt.
And I'm Samantha Zuckerman.
And welcome to Drawing Conclusions, the show where we talk about the paranormal and murders and murderers and things like that, while we draw pretty and probably upsetting pictures sometimes.
Probably not too upsetting, like...
I don't know, you've seen my artwork.
Well, yeah, but it's still, like, YouTube friendly.
Yeah, that's
et
fair.
cetera, et cetera.
It won't be, like, explicit.
It'll just be like, ugh.
Yeah.
I wish I hadn't.
Yeah. So what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about the co-ed killer, Ed Kemper.
Ooh.
Or Edmund Emil Kemper III, if we're going to be specific.
The big boy.
Yes. And some things I do want to note before we get into a lot of this, because I feel like it's important and it's going to come up later as we talk. Pretty much everything that we know about Edmund Kemper is in his own words.
Yes, he was like the first, like one of the first serial killers to be so vocal about his repertoire.
Yeah, Ed doesn't shut the fuck up.
Mm-hmm.
We'll cover that.
You can say fuck in a podcast.
Yeah, but not on YouTube. So you'll have to bleep
Not
me.
in the first minute, but we're at a minute 33.
Oh, look at us go.
Yeah.
He talks and talks and talks. The problem that becomes of that, though, is that we can't guarantee that some of the information we have is true or fully truthful.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes up pretty quick in this. So I just wanted to lay that over everything and just say that
This is in his own words.
Mostly, yeah.
For the most part.
There are things that we do have other sources for, but it's Ed Kemper by Ed Kemper.
Mm-hmm.
So my sources for this...
And if there's one thing that we know about serial killers and murderers, it's not super trustworthy people.
No.
Not very honest.
The deeper I got into this, the more I realized that I can't trust anyone.
Yeah, that's fair. That sounds like true crime in general.
Yes. So my sources for this were Wikipedia, Front Page Detective Magazine, an article specifically by a woman named Marge von Berldingen.
Okay.
And we can put some of these in the description of the video in case anybody wanted to hunt them down.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But this woman was actually one of the very first people to interview Ed Kemper for, like, the media and not just as, like, a psychiatrist or a cop.
Okay.
And it was promised to her by Ed at his trial that he would sit down for an interview with her. Then we have biography.com, and then I regrettably listened to some interviews of Ed Kemper that are difficult to find the original sources for because a lot of this is from the 70s.
That's fair. But it was like the interviews with him. It was like audio of him speaking.
Yes, and videos, but I just kind of ignored the video because if I have to listen to his stupid voice, I don't want to also look at his stupid face.
That's fair.
So starting out, we're going to kind of talk about Ed Kemper's upbringing and what made this man. So Ed Kemper III was born December 18th, 1948 in Burbank, California, to Clarnell and Edmund Kemper II.
Those are some names.
We're going to talk about Clarnell a lot.
Okay. Clarnell is his mother?
Clarnell is his mother.
I'm assuming Edmund Kemper wasn't his mother.
Was his mother. Yes, it's an unfortunate name.
It's a family name, unfortunately.
It's a family name. Ed Kemper was 13 pounds when he was born.
Wow, he did a lot of growing.
Yeah, but 13 pounds?
That's a lot.
I was 10 and I was a big baby. I was the biggest baby that, like, the floor had at the time of my birth. And you're a tall person now, but I think your mom and I have talked about it and you were like 7 pounds.
Yeah, it's like 7 or 8.
Yeah.
Something like that.
So.
Which, like, again, we've mentioned this briefly. I don't know if we've come out and said it yet, but Ed Kemper was 6'9", correct?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a lot. He was 6'9" and 300 pounds.
Yeah, I'm 6'4", and I rarely encounter another human being that is at my eye level. So, let alone above it.
Yeah.
And just
how would that feel for you?
It's whenever I come into contact with someone who is my height, or my height, I'm usually like, wow, that's a tall person. If they're taller than me, I'm just like, oh wow, okay.
Yeah.
And then I get why people would always come up to me and be like, "You play basketball?" Because that's like my first thought when I see them is like, "Man, I bet they kill it at hoops."
Yeah, I mean, I'm 4'11", so the thing about being a short person is that you're just kind of looking up at everybody all the time. So there's a certain point where height just sounds fake.
Yeah, that's fair.
Because it's like, oh yeah, this person is taller than this person, and it just, okay, what does that mean to me?
It's just arbitrary at a certain point.
Yeah, my neck already hurts. So Ed's mother, Clarnell, was known by not just Ed. This is one of the few things that we have that is verified by a lot of people. Clarnell was known to be overbearing and aggressive.
Okay.
Ed Kemper's father, Ed Kemper, once said that suicide missions in wartime and the atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with Clarnell.
Yikes.
So that's everything we really need to know. She refused to coddle Ed, fearing that any affection from her would, quote, turn him gay.
Okay.
Which... I don't know.
Seems a little problematic.
Doesn't it? She was known to abuse and belittle Ed, but allegedly did not show the same treatment to his sisters. And this is something that is, kind of confirmed by everybody else, but mostly we only know from Ed.
Yeah.
And so that could be, Ed just kind of fabricating parts of his life.
Yeah, trying to justify his actions.
Yeah, but then on the other hand, that is a thing that happens, especially in siblings. There's usually, if a parent is abusive, it's usually not to all of the siblings. It's usually to one, and usually to the one who is different in some manner. So he had 2 sisters, and he was the only boy, and also he was huge.
Yes.
So it's one of those things that could go either way.
Okay.
I don't know, I wasn't there, and we really only have testimony from Ed on that.
Mm-hmm.
In 1957, Ed Kemper's parents divorced, and this was a huge blow to Ed because he was very close with his father, but his father didn't take him with him. And that's pretty common for 1957. The mother kept the kids, and the dad moved on.
Mm-hmm. And made more kids with some other lady.
We'll get there. So Ed was left behind to live in Montana with his mother, who exacerbated a lot of his behaviors. At 14, Ed ran away to live with his father in California, only to find that his father had remarried and had a stepson. So he didn't have another kid, but he did have a stepson now.
Okay.
And Ed lived...
Competition.
We really don't learn a lot about Ed's dad, aside from, they had a close relationship, and then he moved, and then...
They had a close relationship. Ed's dad will not admit to that, I assume.
Well, I think it was close for Ed, but we're about to get into why I don't know if his dad really had a whole lot of...
Oh, I don't think we stated this earlier, but I feel like we should clear it up now. This is most definitely a comedy look at things. We are gonna be as factual as possible, and we're gonna do our best to show respect to the victims of these horrible people in bad situations. But we're gonna do so in a way that makes us comfortable, which is to add levity.
Yes. I'm uncomfortable with serious topics, but I'm fascinated by horrible things.
Hello, Chloe.
I think there's just something really interesting about this topic, but I am very careful around the victims.
Yeah.
This is me making fun of Ed Kemper and his stupid, stupid face. So Ed went to go find his dad, found him, and he had remarried and had a stepson.
Okay.
He lived briefly with his dad.
Chloe, do you need to leave? You can't just sit here and meow every time we stop talking. She has a lot of thoughts and feelings about this.
She loves murder. She is a cat.
That's true. It's in her nature.
So Ed lived with his father for a little bit. But apparently, he gave his stepmother migraines. So his father sent him to live with his with Ed's paternal grandparents.
Okay.
This was a problem specifically because, at least according to Ed, Ed's grandmother was really, really, really similar to his own mom.
Okay. I mean, that's not, like, super outside of the realm of possibility, I guess.
That they're similar women?
Yes.
I mean, it is kind of that, like, you date somebody that is similar to your parentage, so it makes sense that Ed Kemper II would seek out somebody who was like his mom, but I dug for any information from anybody else about Ed's grandparents, but it was only what Ed said.
Gotcha.
He claimed that she was constantly emasculating him and his grandfather. I can't find... With Clarnell and Ed Kemper II, I can find where Ed Kemper II said, no, this woman was a nightmare, but I can't find anything that says that his grandfather was unhappy with his wife, so I'm gonna go with, I don't know, maybe.
Yeah. There's a possibility that that's how it was.
Maybe. Who knows? So we now know that sometimes there's warning signs and sometimes there aren't. But Ed Kemper is the one that kind of pointed investigators to feeling that, like, children exhibit certain behaviors if they're going to be a murderer. Ed had the warning signs, but these are all, once again, in Ed's words, and there's some that I'm gonna talk about that I will tell you, I don't know if I believe it.
Okay.
So, at 10 years old, Ed buried a family cat alive.
Okay.
After the cat died,
Uh-huh.
Ed dug it up, decapitated it, and mounted its head on a spike.
Okay. Foreshadowing.
Allegedly, Ed claims to have derived pleasure from lying to his family about the fate of the cat.
Okay.
This is the one that I don't personally buy, because if he buried this cat in the property and then dug it up and put its head on a spike, how did nobody in the family find it or notice that this had happened?
Right? That there was just like a cat's head on a spike around?
Yeah, so I think that this one is kind of bungus.
Okay. That's fair.
This one, however, at 13, Ed killed another family cat because he felt that it liked his sister more than him.
See, that I buy.
That one I buy because he doesn't go into all of these weird specific details about it. However, after killing the cat, Ed kept pieces of it in his closet until his mother found them. I don't know. Everything just said kept pieces of it in his closet, and I don't know if they were just, like, loose or, like, in boxes.
I mean, based on the way that the man speaks, he seems at least semi-intelligent. He probably kept them in, like, a Ziploc bag or like some kind of saran wrap situation.
Maybe, I don't know. That one, I believe 1 out of 2 cats were harmed in the making of this man.
Oh, I believe that he probably murdered 2 cats. I think the details about what he did with them thereafter
Yeah,
are
I
a little
think that's
iffy.
a little... This gets out of the weird animal stuff and then gets worse.
Oh, good.
Somehow. Ed liked to perform rituals with his sister's dolls in which he removed the dolls' heads and hands.
That's nice.
Normal.
That's a nice normal thing that, boys will be boys.
Boys sure will. And Ed will as well. He, in the 2nd grade, became infatuated with his teacher and would hide in the bushes around her house and watch her through the windows. And just to make it worse, he brought a bayonet with him.
Oh. Just in case.
Yeah. 2nd grader with a bayonet. It's fine. When his sister teased him about this crush, she asked, "Why don't you try to kiss her if you like her so much?" Which is
Something
valid
that a child
sibling.
would say.
Yeah. But then Ed took it up to 1,000 and said, "I'd have to kill her first."
Oh.
Which is where things take a turn. He liked to play games that he charmingly called electric chair and gas chamber.
Oh.
Kid stuff.
Yeah.
Basically, the premise of these games is that his sisters would tie him up and flip an imaginary switch, and then he would flop around on the floor and pretend to be dying.
Oh, practicing for his future.
Which is normal. His older sister tried to kill him, like a lot. Like a lot. She tried to drown him. She tried to push him in front of an oncoming train.
Damn, okay.
And I'm gonna be honest, I didn't read this anywhere, but I'd be surprised if there weren't more cases of her trying to kill him. Because you don't just go from, haha, I'm drowning you, to I'm pushing you in front of a train.
I don't know, those seem pretty close. Like, the opportunity, like, the drowning one is almost more hands-on. Like, you have to make the decision to hold someone under the water, but if you're just, like, walking near some train tracks and you see a train coming, that's just the opportunity arises.
So this is where it really shows that, like, we have Ed's words and Ed's dramatization of everything. He claims she tried to kill me.
Okay.
She tried to drown me. But he also says, well, she pushed me into the deep end of a pool. Which is very different from actively drowning. So,
yeah.
Take that as you will. His mother was convinced that he was going to hurt either her or his sisters. So she would lock him in the basement every night.
Okay.
Like, that's where his bedroom was, but she would lock him in.
Yeah.
So that he couldn't, like, creep around at night.
So it sounds like they knew some shit was gonna go down.
They probably found the cats.
Yeah, right?
They were probably just like, "Where's Smokey?" And he was like, "I don't know," with his stupid Ed Kemper voice.
Maybe you should check my closet, Mother.
Yeah, that's a very good Ed Kemper. Please never do that outside of this podcast. I'll cry. So then, we're going to kind of start going chronologically from here.
Okay.
And we're going to start at when he moves to his grandparents' house. So, his grandmother's name was Maud Matilda Huey Kemper, and his grandfather was Edmund Kemper I.
Perfect. Got it.
Ed felt that his grandfather was senile.
Okay.
There is no evidence I think he was just not a bitter old man, so he must have been senile. And he compared living with his grandmother to being in jail.
Okay, was this after he had been in jail that he was saying this?
No.
Oh, okay. So sure.
What he imagines jail is like.
Right. I wonder if they like revisited that question later. It's like, now that you've spent most of your life behind bars, do you still akin living with your grandmother to being here?
Yes.
You know, if I could put it into 150 words or more, I would have to say that...
He says the dumbest things, and we're about to have another one. So Ed's grandfather kept a gun in the house because they were out in the country. That's really not that uncommon for this time and place.
Mm-hmm.
But if his grandparents ever left the house, his grandmother would take the gun with her because she was afraid that Edmund would play with it.
Okay.
And
Valid
then,
concern.
in an interview, like one of his first interviews, he tells the dumbest story ever about how she took the gun with her, and he, right after they left, he goes looking for this gun, and he's like, I don't know why she thought it was a problem. Well, because you were looking for it.
Uh-huh.
So then he tells this whole story about how he's like, I wanted to call the cops and tell them she was wandering town with a gun and planning a holdup, but there's no point to that story because he didn't do it.
Yeah, it's just...
I'm just talking to talk because I'm Ed Kemper and I'm the worst.
Yeah.
So then, at the age of 15, August 27th, 1964, Ed got into an argument with his grandmother in the kitchen while his grandfather was out at the store. And instead of doing literally anything else that he could have done, he left the kitchen, shot her in the head, and then twice more in the back.
Okay.
Some people say that she also suffered from several stab wounds, but this hasn't been confirmed anywhere. This is kind of that rumor that happens with really big stories like this.
Mm-hmm. No available, like, autopsy reports or anything of that nature?
Yeah, no, I can't find anything that far back.
That's good.
When Ed's grandpa returned home from the store, Ed met him outside at his car and shot him as well. He then claimed in interviews to have killed his grandfather because he didn't want him to have to witness seeing his wife dead.
Sure. That's the thing that comes up with a lot of murderers is like, oh, I killed them because I didn't want them to have to... Like, you just wanted to kill somebody.
Yeah. After literally murdering his grandparents, Ed then turns around and calls his mother, the person that he cannot stand the most in the world. He calls his mother and asks her what to do.
Okay.
So...
Seems like a logical thing.
Yeah. Being at least sort of reasonable, his mom says, either you call the cops right now or I call them for you. So he called the cops and was arrested. The cops asked him why he did it, and he said, I wanted to see what it felt like to kill Grandma.
Okay, that seems... See, this is a brief tangent.
Yes.
There was a murder that happened in my hometown. This kid had shot his mother and sister and then called the police on himself. And that was another thing. It was like the same thing. Whenever the 911 operator, I listened to the whole like 20-minute 911 call. It was rough. But she asked him like why he did it, and the kid's like, I just wanted to see if I would like it. I didn't though. And it's like, okay, but then why did you kill them both?
Yeah,
Did
you
you
would
not
think, did
get
you
the
not
picture after
notice
the first
after
one?
the first one? So the police decided that this really wasn't their problem.
Oh, okay.
In the first of many bungles. And handed Ed over to the California Youth Authority.
Okay.
And they basically determined that this was an incomprehensible crime for a 15-year-old to commit. So they sent Ed to Atascadero State Hospital, which was a mental hospital for mentally ill convicts.
Okay.
Atascadero proved over and over and over throughout this story that mental health in the 70s was just a bunch of dudes standing around and shrugging and then like spinning a wheel to see what they wanted to diagnose people with, because
it's like one step above medical help in like the way back times where it was like, here, do some cocaine about it.
Yeah, this is a story. Listen, everything that happened in Ed Kemper's criminal career was entirely his fault, and I acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
But I also blame this hospital for everything that happens.
Oh yeah, for not preventing it in some way.
Yeah, because it's about to get wild.
Okay.
So instead of your blood pressure's gonna go up because you're gonna think how and why and who. So instead of testing Ed for things like, disorders that he could be struggling with and figuring out ways to treat them, they said, I want to know what his IQ is.
Yeah. Okay.
So they gave him an IQ test, and at first he tested at a 136, which is really high.
Mm-hmm.
The average is between 85 and 115.
Okay.
Then they tested him again,
Mm-hmm.
and he scored a 145.
Is that... What was the first number?
136.
136. Okay, so he got higher the second time.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is somebody who's apparently very smart. I disagree.
Uh-huh.
And I know that IQ tests don't necessarily test, like, how smart are you, what is your capacity for learning.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I don't know exactly what they're testing. But I know that it's not just, like, you're super smart, good work. I think it's more like reasoning and problem-solving skills.
Yeah. Which, like, I mean, if he were that much of a genius, he wouldn't have got caught. He wouldn't have called the cops on himself.
Yeah. So, you and I know, and probably a lot of the people listening know, that there are a lot of issues with telling somebody who is really self-centered and egotistical that they are super smart.
Oh, yes.
And so Ed...
They should never be informed.
Yeah, no, they should have kept that information to themselves. But they were sharing everything about Ed with Ed.
Mm.
So, you know how your psychiatrist, when you, like, if you go to a therapist or a counselor, or really any doctor, they're, like, writing stuff down on a clipboard?
Yeah, and you're never supposed to see that.
You can. There's nothing... If you can request those files. Like, those are your medical information. But typically with patients like this, you don't. For so many reasons, you don't just hand it over and talk about what you found with them. But his doctors were just kind of constantly like, yo, Ed, do you want to look at your files? Let's talk about them. Mm-hmm. So they informed him of this, and Ed Kemper became obsessed with his own intelligence. And that is kind of when he started to just talk and never shut up. Mm-hmm. Because he feels that he is the key to finding every other murderer, because that's what they told him.
Yeah.
Initially, Ed was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and then the diagnosis was later changed to the much less severe personality trait disturbance, passive-aggressive type. So basically they went from saying, like, this is a person who has paranoid schizophrenia, which I don't know if he did or didn't. And I am also not saying that people
Seems
with
plausible.
Paranoid schizophrenia are going to hurt people, because usually, almost always, they don't. People with schizophrenia are almost always at a much greater risk of being harmed by their family and by strangers. Mm-hmm. But if left untreated, it can be really dangerous to both the person and the people around them.
Yeah.
So
like
they
most
just...
mental illnesses.
Yeah. They just decided that they weren't going to move forward with that at all. And went instead with, like, he's just kind of an aggressive kid, is basically what that second diagnosis is.
Okay. I mean, also not inaccurate, but yeah, seems a little lacking.
Yeah, it just kind of brushes over the issue because they liked him. His doctors really enjoyed him.
I see, because he was charming and charismatic, I
Because he was a white dude.
That too. Yeah.
So instead of, treating him like somebody who murdered his grandparents, the psychiatrist taught him how to administer psychological tests to other inmates.
Oh.
Specifically, sex offenders.
Okay.
Talking to these sex offenders and doing their psychoanalysis is how he learned, one, how to manipulate his own doctors to convince them that he was doing way better.
Yeah.
Basically, he would look at the behaviors of these people and determine, I need to act completely opposite of this.
Yeah, it seems like he's less schizophrenic and more sociopathic. Like, very much... Not so much like not understanding social cues and that side of it, but learning how to function socially. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think personally that Edmund Kemper had full control of his faculties and knew exactly what he was doing in every moment. I don't really think that he was diagnosable with anything. I think that from a really young age, he felt that he was more deserving of things than others and acted out when he didn't get them.
Yeah,
and
I think that's fair.
We can get into a little bit later when we talk about his later crimes, why I am really pinpointed on that being my theory.
Okay.
But talking to these sex offenders in the hospital and doing their psych evals, these convicts and the worst of the worst people gave him advice on how to commit crimes later.
Yeah.
Basically, a lot of them told him, if you're gonna harm a woman, you have to kill her because she'll go to the cops if you don't.
Yeesh.
And so that's where he kind of decided in that moment that
he was like, oh, I guess I'm gonna be a serial killer when I get out of here.
But then, as a 21st birthday gift, Atascadero decided to just let Ed go.
Oh, happy birthday!
Uh-huh.
He'd been in since he was 15?
15 to 21.
Okay. Sure, I'm sure he was fully reformed.
Mm-hmm. It gets worse.
And I'm sure we won't hear anything about Ed after that point.
It gets so much worse. Ed's psychiatrist strongly recommended that he never ever live with his mother and that contact with his mother be limited. So they released him into the care of his mother.
Oh yeah, of course. It only makes sense.
So then he had parole meetings that he had to attend and parole psych treatments and meetings. And in 1972, he had his final meeting where his psychiatrist said the following: if I were to see this patient without having any history available or getting any history from him, I would think that we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who was free from any psychiatric illnesses. It is my opinion that he has made a very excellent response to the years of treatment and rehabilitation, and I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be of any danger to himself or to any member of society. And since it may allow him more freedom as an adult to develop his potential, I would consider it reasonable to have a permanent expunsion of his juvenile records.
Wow. Okay.
So they removed the record of him murdering his grandparents.
Wow. Okay.
Uh-huh.
That...
I'm gonna let you digest that.
Yeah, that's upsetting. Okay, I know that when he was 15, he murdered 2 people in cold blood. But he seems like a well-adjusted fellow now. So, now that he's... I'm pretty sure the drinking age was lower back then. But now that he's of age, we'll just go ahead and let him back out into the world. And we'll also just get rid of those 2 little blights on his record, also known as dead grandparents. That's absurd.
Yeah.
I think they kind of dropped the ball with that one a little bit.
Oh, it just keeps getting dropped. After his release, he was mandated to attend community college as part of his parole.
Okay.
And he decided that the thing that he wanted to study for was to be a police officer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Surprising no one.
That tracks.
He was rejected from the police program because he was too tall.
That's a thing?
It was at the time. I don't know if it still is.
Wow, I've never heard that before. That's interesting.
At this point, he's 6'9".
Yeah.
But don't worry, because he became BFFs with every cop in town, and hung out with them at a local cop bar. I don't know what that is. It was called the Jury Room. I guess there's bars that love cops. It's not me.
Not my scene.
Not my deal. What a boring bar.
Seems like a place where you can really let loose and have fun.
So yeah, he was BFFs with all of these cops, and I'm going to talk about this here instead of during the murders because I don't really get into the murders a ton because it's grotesque and I don't want to be disrespectful.
Yeah, we'll just touch on... We'll give enough information so that people know what was going on.
Yeah.
What exactly he was doing, but not grim, gory details.
Yeah, so
It's not that kind of show.
Gonna be touching on this here. During his murder spree, he was hanging out with these cops in this bar and talking to them about the cases. So he knew exactly how far off they were from figuring out who did it.
Yeah, knew how much information they had, who they were looking for, who they were looking at, I'm sure.
Yeah, and he knew that they didn't even realize that all of these murders had been linked.
Yeah.
Which is fair because I think there were like 3 other serial killers operating in the same area at the same time.
Wow.
I believe Ted Bundy was one of them.
Really?
And I don't know. We might cover that one later, but so don't quote me on that, but it was around the same time.
Okay.
So the whole time they're investigating this, and you're not supposed to talk about an open investigation with anybody who's not a cop for obvious reasons. And I will give the very bare minimum of conceit to the fact that, like, we all talk about our jobs. Like, doctors go home or go to a bar and talk to their friends about a patient they saw. Everybody's going to talk about their jobs, especially if it's a stressful job where you're hunting a murderer. Because sometimes you want to talk about something to somebody who isn't also dealing with the crushing pressure of it all. However, if somebody keeps coming up to you and asking, hey, what's up with this murder? What's up with that one? And they have shifty eyes and talk like Ed Kemper, don't tell them.
Right?
I'm just saying. And the cops there did consider him like a friendly nuisance, is what they said. They were like, he was annoying, but like he was fine. So
I mean, we've both worked in bars. I think we have a pretty good.
Yeah, we know the friendly nuisance.
Yeah. I would hope none of them are serial murderers.
I trust no one anymore. So that's the cop bar and Ed's obsession with police officers.
Okay.
While he was, hanging out with cops and going to community college and visiting his psychiatrists and his parole officers, he was fighting viciously with his mother. He tried to move out and was planning on living with a friend, and he did that for a couple months, but then, financial difficulties kicked in, and he ended up moving back in with her.
Okay.
So, in his words, he couldn't escape her, and even while he was living somewhere else, she would just show up.
Interesting.
And she didn't like him, so that's the weirdest thing she could have done.
Yeah, right? Like, what is that about?
Yeah.
Just give him some space. You're gonna drive him to murder, woman. I mean, he's headed that way anyway.
Yeah, So, he started working for, the highway department. I guess I couldn't really find what that is. I'm just guessing it was, highway cleanup, etc. And with the money that he made from that, he bought a motorcycle. Apparently, they make motorcycles that fit somebody who's 6'9" and 300 pounds. Who knew? But
it's
then
the big and tall Harley store.
Yeah. But then Ed Kemper got hit by a car on his motorcycle. Not hard enough.
Probably because he was taking up most of the lanes.
Oh. And it, like, broke his arm really bad. I don't know. It could have been, should have been so much worse. But he got it was like a $15,000 settlement. It equates to about $90,000 as of 2019. With that, he bought a car, like a car.
Okay. Getting out of the cycle gang.
Yeah. When he got this car, he started just kind of driving around the highways and realized that a lot of young women are looking for rides on the side of the highway because it's the 70s. Don't hitchhike. I know it's not super popular anymore.
There has been like a little bit of a resurgence, and I think that needs to stop.
You really don't know who you're getting into a car with.
No.
And there's so many horrible tales. This is not the only person who used hitchhiking.
Oh no, tons of people, tons of murderers.
Yeah.
Because your victims are gonna come to you. You don't even, you just gotta drive around and they're just there waiting.
Yeah. Well, in their kind of thought process, and unfortunately what the truth kind of became, is that, people who are out this far hitchhiking, their families and loved ones already assume that they're not going to hear from them for a while. There are no cell phones.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to take way longer for somebody to come looking.
Yeah.
For somebody that they know, if they are still on speaking terms, they already know that this person is going to be hard to reach, and they're not going to hear from them very much.
Mm-hmm.
So once he realized how many people he was passing, how many young women specifically, he started carrying plastic bags, knives, blankets, and handcuffs, probably borrowed from his cop friends.
Probably. They at least probably pointed him in the direction of where to get some.
Yeah. And he just kind of kept those in the back of his car. But, being such a good dude, he claims that he picked up about 150 women before his little zapples started.
Is that what he refers to his murders as?
To guess what little zapples are?
I'm assuming they're women he killed, but is there more to it than that?
It's his urge to kill.
Oh, I see.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you give it such a fun little name, it doesn't sound like an urge to kill.
It sounds so much worse to me than if he just said, homicidal rage.
Oh, yeah, it's upsetting.
Yeah.
For sure.
I hate it. And I just hear it in his voice.
My little zapples.
Ugh.
They're just really... I'm hankering for a zapple.
I hate it. I hate his face. So now we have his spree.
Okay.
I'm only, for the majority of these murders, except for the final two, I'm just going to be listing out the names of the women that he killed and the date that they were murdered. Because there are so many, and they are horrible. And everybody's covered Ed Kemper. You can find this information really easily. There's no reason for me to get into all of it here.
That's fair.
So, May 7th, 1972, Ed Kemper killed Mary Ann Pesci and Anita Lucchesa. September 14th, 1972, he killed Aiko Koo. January 7th, 1973, he killed Cindy Shaw. And February 5th, 1973, he killed Rosalind Thorpe and Allison Liu.
Okay, so sometimes multiple victims in a day.
Multiple victims at the same time. These were girls who were traveling together.
Gotcha.
And he would pick them both up
Ugh.
and attack them both at the same time. One important note that I am going to get into about these murders.
Mm-hmm.
Ed claims that every time he killed
Mm-hmm.
was right after he had been arguing with his mother. So, all of these gaps here in this, he was still killing women. He was still picking up hitchhikers and picking up women.
He just wasn't always killing them.
Yeah, he would apparently only do that if he had just fought with his mother. I don't think that's true. I think that he is looking for a way to push the blame onto somebody else. Like, oh, if my mother wasn't so horrible, I wouldn't have killed. Yeah. And as somebody who fights with their parents constantly, I've never killed anybody, and I've never had the urge to kill anybody after I argue with them. Yeah. Obviously, I'm not Ed Kemper, but what I'm getting at is lots of people argue with their parents and don't kill anybody just because of it.
Yeah, exactly. I would argue it's a pretty normal thing to argue with your parents from time to time. Not such a normal thing to be murdering people on the regs.
But, you know, eventually even that came to a head, and now I am going to be talking about murder. On April 20th, 1973, Clarnell Strandberg returned from a party. Her return woke Ed, who came into her room. Allegedly, Clarnell said, "I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now."
Mm-hmm.
Ed claims to have responded, "No, good night," and then waited for her to fall asleep. After Clarnell fell asleep, Ed returned to her room, bludgeoned her with a claw hammer, and then slit her throat. Afterwards, he decapitated her, sexually violated her head, and then placed the head on a shelf.
Okay. So just like hearkening back to the old glory days of the cat.
Yes, and then it gets worse. He claims to have spent an hour screaming at his mother's head before throwing darts at it. Okay. Then he cut out her tongue and larynx? Her, vocal cords, yeah. I guess. And attempted to throw them both in the garbage disposal, but it wouldn't, break everything down, and so it just kind of, came back up. And he
Bummer.
Gave up on that, I guess.
Just moved on.
And then he hid his mother's body in a closet and went to have a drink.
Okay. I
don't know, because he...
went out probably to the jury bar. What was it called?
The jury room.
The jury room?
They just say to a bar, but that's the only bar that we ever mention Ed going to, and it's the only bar I've ever heard of him going to, so that's what I'm assuming.
Why would he change it up at that point?
Yeah.
Go hang out with his cop friends.
Exactly. So I assume he then went and hung out with a bunch of cops.
Uh-huh.
Then... after Ed returns home from the bar, he invites over his mother's best friend, Sally Hallett, and claims that his mother would like to have her over for dinner and a movie.
Okay.
This is a lie.
Well, clearly, because his mother is mostly in a closet, partially chilling on a shelf.
I think he had moved the head at this point.
Oh, okay.
I don't know
He put it away before he went out.
The details get vague from here.
Okay. Seems like he was kind of, that seems like a big one that he kind of started...
breaking down.
Yeah, losing it after that.
Mm-hmm. So he invites over Sally Hallett, and when she arrives, he strangles her to death, and then hid her body in a closet.
Okay.
And this one, while the most unfortunate because this woman had literally nothing to do with any of this.
Yeah.
It was the least gruesome. He always had a tendency to decapitate or otherwise mutilate.
Mm-hmm.
This one, he just strangled her and hid her in the closet. And his reasoning was that he wanted people to just assume that these two had gone on vacation together.
Okay.
I don't understand. Then he wrote a note to leave for the police, who he assumed would show up. and said approximately 5:15 a.m. Saturday. No need for her to suffer any more at the hands of this horrible, murderous butcher, in quotes. It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it. Not sloppy and incomplete, gents. Just a lack of time. I've got things to do. 3 exclamation points. Then he guzzled a bunch of caffeine pills and started driving 1,000 miles away to Pueblo, California.
Okay. Were the caffeine pills just so he didn't fall asleep driving?
Yeah, he drove in one shot, aside from, like, stopping for gas.
This is from where?
From one town in California to another, as far as I understand.
Okay, I mean, California's a big state, so it's...
Yeah, he drove 1,000 miles.
Okay.
I don't...
That's a lot in one shot.
Somehow I lost, like, where this murder happened. But I know that he drove 1,000 miles away from the murder scene to Pueblo, California.
Okay.
And was hopped up on caffeine pills so that he could just keep driving. The entire time he was fleeing, he was convinced that he was being hunted by the police.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he was convinced that they had found the bodies and that they knew it was him.
Okay.
And then when he arrived in Pueblo and discovered that literally nobody knew anything and nobody was looking for him, he called the cops himself and said that he murdered his mother and Sally Hallett. And the cops who answered the phone said, call back later. They did not believe him. And then they hung up.
It was probably somebody that he knew on the phone.
Well, I don't think so, because later he asks for somebody that he knows. So this cop just said, okay, and then moved on.
Yeah.
So then, after a couple of hours, in which I guess he just stood around and paced, I don't know. He called the cops a second time and specifically requested to talk to somebody that he knew and confessed again. And then he waited and was brought into police custody back in the town where the murder had happened.
Okay.
And then there he confessed to the murder of the 6 co-eds, the 6 students that he had picked up and killed.
Okay.
At this point, we're going to start getting into, like, the trials and imprisonment. So on May 7th, 1973, which was exactly 1 year to the day of his first murder of Marianne Pesce and Anita Lucchesa, Ed Kemper was indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder.
Okay.
His team and himself tried to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, and the court basically said, go fuck yourself.
Good for them. I hope that part of that was them being like, well, you see, we've got these records from your psychiatrist here saying that you are a fully functioning adult man.
Yeah, it basically, so the psychiatrist that went through everything basically said, like, his psychiatrists before us have said that, you know, they believe that he's fine, so I don't know what you want us to do. I think he's got full control over himself.
Yeah, it seems like he's fine.
And chose to do this. On November 8th, 1973, the jury deliberated for 5 hours before declaring Ed Kemper sane and guilty on all counts.
Good for them.
And then this asshole requested to be put to death by torture. And I assume that everybody there
laughed.
Kicked him in the teeth. However, the death penalty was under a moratorium in California. So basically, like, it was not, you could not put somebody to death. So he didn't get what he wants.
Good.
And instead sits in prison giving shitty, annoying interviews and talking about how great and amazing he is.
And reading audiobooks.
Yeah, don't buy his fucking audiobooks.
Which might be hard because I hear that he holds, like, the record for the most...
Does he?
I could be wrong. I could be making that up. But I know that he's done, like, thousands.
I hate that.
Yeah.
I know that he has a book. I did not investigate any more into that. I wanted to avoid as much of Ed in Ed's words as possible, because I hate him.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I think that he's really just kind of full of himself.
Oh, absolutely. I think that there was important, like, the fact that Ed Kemper and the things that he did, horrible as they are, led to the FBI actually putting together a way to profile serial killers in an attempt to catch people more easily in the future. I think that's good. I don't think that, like, obviously it's not good that he murdered a bunch of people. That's really messed up.
Yeah.
But at least something good did come out of it in the end.
Yeah, my biggest problem with a lot of that is that with, like, profiling, like FBI profiling, a lot of that information now we know is, like, so specific to Ed Kemper alone.
And he is, like, a bit of an outlier when it comes to that stuff, too. He's like, he just would not shut up about himself.
Yeah, and normally these guys, you'll kind of see in other killers, they almost talk about it like they weren't there. Ed Kemper is like, no, I did it. You want to know how I did it?
Yeah, let me tell you. Let me read you a whole story about all the ways that I've done it. And the ways that I'll continue doing it if you ever let me out of here.
Yeah. But also, like, so some of his warning signs are warning signs that we now know aren't necessarily always present. Like, we now know that animal torture is not common or even indicative of a future killer.
Really?
Yeah, we know
I didn't know that.
So we've basically learned that, like, the problem with little kids and harming animals is that little kids don't have empathy yet.
Yeah, they haven't developed that.
You really don't until you're, like, a teenager. So typically...
Some people even later.
Some people never,
Yeah,
but...
that's true.
So sometimes there's things that little kids do if they're not being properly monitored, and throughout the 70s they mostly weren't.
Yeah, that's fair.
So, like, little kids, when they're hurting a small animal, it's not usually out of malice. It's, like, they're testing things. They're learning, and they don't really understand that this thing hurts, and it doesn't hurt them that this thing hurts.
Yeah.
So, really all we can do about that part is just monitor our kids, and that's way more common today. You know, you have a 1-year-old nephew, and he cannot go anywhere without somebody knowing exactly where he is.
Oh, yeah. Today, he vomited up the entire contents of his stomach because he swallowed a chip too soon. Like, you gotta have eyes on that kid at all times.
Yes. And that's just... We don't just, like, lose our children into the world with animals.
You shouldn't.
No.
If you're out there listening and you were thinking about it, don't.
Yeah.
If you're gonna have animals around your kid, you be keeping an eye on your kid.
Yeah.
Even if you're not, keep an eye on your kid. Watch your kids.
Watch your kids. Watch your pets. Watch your kids. But the thing that we've kind of nailed down more in, like, here's a common thing that future killers and rapists might do is that we know that almost every single person who has been profiled for this type of thing has been a very long-term bedwetter.
Really?
Like, very long-term, like, into their teens.
Interesting.
Which, unless it's being caused by a medical issue, which, like, for a lot of boys, if they have UTIs, they will wet the bed, but not psychologically, that is a physical impairment.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
And it's usually because they themselves are being molested, and that is a psychological thing that happens to kids when that is occurring. So we know that, like, one of two things is happening to a kid if they are a chronic, long-term bedwetter. Either something bad is happening to them in their home, or they are psychologically unwell. The other thing that we just kind of understand about, like, the 1970s being rife with serial killers is that people in the 40s and 50s and 60s just did not give a shit what their kids saw. Like,
yeah.
Because, like, if we look at his whole thing about, like, he likes to play electric chair and gas chamber.
Mm-hmm.
He'd have to know about that some way.
Oh, yeah.
Which means that his parents just were not paying attention to what he was consuming or to what they were telling him.
Yeah, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if they were just kind of oblivious to the fact that it could even be an issue, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Especially based on the things that have been confirmed about his mother by others, like people other than him. I wouldn't be surprised if she just wasn't really paying attention.
Yeah. And then on top of all of this other, like, the things that quote-unquote made him, I still don't know where I stand on whether or not serial killers are made or born.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really complex...
I think it varies from case to case, honestly.
But on top of all of that, this was a huge failing on every institution that met him.
Oh, absolutely. There were so many times that the ball was dropped. You can't even keep count at this point.
Yeah. The fact that he murdered his grandparents with the reasoning, I just wanted to see what it was like.
And then later had that expunged from his record completely.
Yeah, that should have never occurred.
Mm-hmm. That should have been, like, sign number one. Like, this kid has issues.
Yeah.
We need to keep an eye on this kid for a long time.
Yeah.
Not just loose him into the world when he's 21.
And, yeah, I mean, at that time, they were like, well, we've had him for 6 years, and he's not like everybody else here, so he must be fine. Unfortunately, we now kind of have a firmer grip on that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I would say fortunately.
Did I not say fortunately?
You said unfortunately.
Oops.
It's all good.
I didn't mean to. This is the most I've talked ever, I think. So I'm losing my grip.
You're doing great.
Thanks. So yeah, I think it's a huge combination of just neglectful and outright awful parenting.
Mm-hmm.
And failure of, like, the system to catch on to what a large problem this was.
Yeah, what was clearly a highly psychologically disturbed individual.
Yeah. And again, like, most people with mental illness are not ever going to harm anybody else. I don't personally think that this was a mental illness situation. I think that he felt that he deserved certain things from people,
mm-hmm.
and when he didn't just receive them, he just snapped. And unfortunately, especially in the 70s, or like 40s through 70s,
mm-hmm.
we raised men to behave that way. Like,
you
take what you want, and if you don't get it, I don't know, murder people, I guess.
Yeah.
So there was just no, like, emotional control taught to him.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, a bunch of psychiatrists told him that he was a fucking genius.
Yeah.
So that is my very brief, because there's so many more places that I could have dug in a little deeper.
Mm-hmm.
But there's already so much here, and I think we've already been talking for about an hour.
Yeah.
So this is my very, like, brief Cliff's Notes version
Of Ed Kemper.
The
co-ed killer. Thank you, everybody, so much for tuning in. Again, I'm Cameron Holt.
And I'm Samantha Zuckerman.
And this has been Drawing Conclusions. If you liked it, don't forget to like the video, subscribe. I don't know how podcasts work, so, like...
You can like and follow.
Oh, neat, yeah. So do all the things if you want to hear more. We had a good time, and
I had a great time.
do you want to go ahead and hint at what we're going to talk about in the next episode?
Yeah, sure. Should I give just the name of the story or try and be elusive so they can draw conclusions?
Oh.
If you like German farms and unsolved mysteries, I think you'll like next episode.
We'll see you then.